I'm very, very happy to introduce Professor Lin Mario Menezes de Souza from the University of Sao Paulo, who's our keynote speaker for today. I've got to know him the last few years, collaborating with a transdisciplinary group in my department. We have a project called Next Generation Global Studies, and Professor Lin Mario is very transnational. I won't tell his life story because then it'll never end, but you can ask him. He's very transnational and also transdisciplinary. And so it's great to have him here, kind of, again, moving a little bit out of the box of call, but also in the box of call as well, and talking about a kind of critical approach to education. He's been involved, he's been the coordinator of the Brazilian National Project of New Literacies, New Technologies and Education, and several important projects in Brazil, and a very nice project which I'm familiar with, which is Read the World Through Other Eyes, which is a really nice kind of intercultural project which he's been involved with. Anyway, I won't talk any longer because you've had enough of me these past few days, and I will pass the word over to Lin Mario, okay? Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca. Can you all hear me? Yes, good. I thank the organization for the invitation to be here and to speak about my work. I'm not going to say what I'm not, but you haven't seen me around in call, so you already know what I'm not. I work in a related area which we call literacies and new technologies. So there are interfaces, but we look at them from different perspectives. I chose this topic today, reading the web, for the different connotations that the word web has. Besides meaning the World Wide Web or the network, the web is also something that spiders use to catch their prey. Right? So the web refers to complexity, this idea of something all-encompassing, but it also refers to something in which we can be trapped. So this is what I want to play with today, this idea of the affordances of the web and also those parts which are not so visible. First, a little bit of my context. Working within Brazil, within foreign language teaching, within teacher education, within pedagogies, and within especially transcultural educational policy. And for us in Brazil, or in general in South America in general, whenever we talk about intercultural or transcultural education, we are talking about the education of minorities, and especially our indigenous minorities. Something perhaps you're not familiar with when you talk about intercultural education. But we can see, we can make bridges. This is, I'm not going to discuss this a lot, but just to give you an idea of context, this is data from a British Council research which has just been published in the last week on foreign language teaching in Brazil and Brazilian educational possibilities for foreign language teaching. And I'm just going to go through these numbers a little bit over here. So 81% refers to the lack of general teaching resources in our public school system. Teachers with no access to textbooks are 56%. The textbook way above the level of the students, 42%. Teachers who take their own technical equipment to school, 61%. And only 25% of schools have access to internet. Okay? Sorry. Now, in relation to teacher attitudes, just some numbers to leave you with. 59% refer to a general rejection of and distance from English as a major difficulty in their professional practice as foreign language teachers. This is what they encounter, a rejection of English. Students who consider English irrelevant, 41%. This is the teacher's attitude. English is not part of our students' reality. 1/3 of teachers say that. And they say that 11% of schools don't consider English relevant. English is basically the only foreign language we teach in our public school system in practice. In theory, we call it foreign language teaching. In practice, it's English. Okay? Okay, so the questions I want to ask, and please excuse me for speaking standing up because, as you all know, as teachers, we literally think on our feet. Okay? The questions I want to ask are, what are we currently doing when we educate through the web? What is the current context of the web? What is the current context of education? And do we educate to reinforce or transform these contexts? The argument I'll be following is a critical awareness of the context of education on the web can help us to critically transform rather than maintain our current contexts. A critical awareness involves understanding why we understand what we understand, and understanding that there are things that we do not and cannot understand. This is the intercultural aspect of what I'm talking about. So it goes against the idea of intercultural education as always being promoting understanding. Okay? A critical awareness involves reflecting on what we do when we do not understand. So, what is the current context of the web? And Rejovic says this, and here they're speaking against those, the digital enthusiasts. Right? He uses the term digital enclosures, which he says that rather than enabling and enhancing two-way, symmetrical, horizontal, and transparent communication, current web ubiquitous interactivity promotes, in fact, verticality and not horizontality. Verticality, inequality, and facilitates exploitation of resources. So contrary to our initial enthusiasm of the web as being something horizontal, a network, and promoting democracy, he is warning us to rethink this idea. He uses the term digital enclosure, and he says this, it's as a way of theorizing the forms of productivity and monitoring the forms of productivity and monitoring facilitated by ubiquitous interactivity. The model of enclosure traces the relationship between a material spatial process, that is the construction of networked interactive environments, and the private expropriation of information. So when we're all interacting on the web, right, someone, perhaps not to our awareness, is accessing what we're doing and using what we're doing to personal benefit, their personal benefit. So when we use Gmail and anything Google, right, we have to remember that, yes, it facilitates what we do. I got here using Google Maps. And whereas the promise of universal interactivity is portrayed by the popularizers of the rhetoric of the digital sublime as a form of liberation, we feel liberated by our digital technology. The model of digital enclosure suggests that ubiquitous interactivity also has the potential to facilitate unprecedented commodification of previously non-proprietary information and an aggressive clampdown of centralized control over information resources. So yes, there is an apparent horizontality to our interaction of whatever we're doing, whether it's personal communication or pedagogical activities on the internet. But besides this, and often not apparent to our eyes, there is also this verticalized process of exploitation of what we are doing. So we have to think of the web in these various possibilities, the horizontality of the web and the verticality of the web. The web is something complex which gives us thousands of affordances, possibilities, but also gives other people affordances to do as they wish is what we are doing. And Rejovic adds, he says, information capture is only part of the story. When we participate in the interactive digital economy, we become lab rats, subject to large-scale, ongoing, controlled experiments conducted by a new breed of market researchers. You all know this, and you suddenly get whilst you're using Gmail or whatever, you suddenly get those ads which come up because once upon a time you browsed through somewhere, right? So this is what we are dealing with. This is our interactivity. Now, what exactly is behind this? We are speaking in a pedagogical context, but this is something that we cannot ignore. Okay? Now, Ted Wolfson adds to this in a recent book called Digital Rebellion. He adds to it in the sense that he also criticizes the tendency to uncritically celebrate the logic of horizontality in web communication. And he states that technological resources are not horizontal and free of contextual effects, such as politics and economics. So, yes, when we are talking about how to teach vocabulary, whatever, using the web, how to be intercultural using the web, there's a political, economical dimension to this that we may not be aware of, right? Bernard Stiegler, the French thinker, says this: I believe we must reopen the question of what links academic research, public education, politics, and economics. It's a question that must be revisited in a profound way. And what I'm saying today is maybe not so profound, but tries to be. Okay? Technology for him as a tool is necessary, and curiously, he's speaking from a very post-Kantian, post-Enlightenment context. He says, technology is what makes us human. So technology is not something that we adds on, it's not something that we can dispense with, right? It's what makes us human. We need it to make ourselves human because we cannot survive without anything which is not human. We need our food, we need our clothing, we need our shelters. All of this is technology. And part of this today is our digital technology. However, technology runs the risk of producing, yes, he uses this word, stupidity, right? What does he mean? He says, if the role of education is to develop reason, and he's following, again, the Enlightenment project of schooling and education, if the role of education is to develop reason, the current use of technology in education or contemporary life seems to develop rationalization and not reason. So he makes a distinction here between rationalization and reason. In what sense? In this sense. He says, reason is the ability of using one's own understanding without the guidance of another about why or how one understands. So reason in the sense of having a certain critical capacity. Using one's own understanding is a source of the capacity to critique or produce knowledge. However, he says, with the current use of technology and its attending features such as speed, efficacy, and multitasking, the time and distance needed for critical thinking is jeopardized. Reason, he says, is lost and replaced with rationalization in the sense of efficiency, efficacy, and the logic of minimum investment and maximum returns. So efficacy means minimum investment, maximum return. So when we are multitasking, that's the height of efficacy from this perspective of rationalization. So reason is thus reified or frozen and becomes a product. And this is what he defines as stupidity. So we are involved in this production of what we think is knowledge, this automatized production, high-speed automatized production of knowledge, but we have lost, he says, our capacity of thinking reasonably or perhaps critically. And this is from a recent book of his, which literally has this in the title. It's States of Shock, Stupidity and Knowledge in the 21st Century. Okay? Now, Roger Simon, the Canadian pedagogue, a long time ago reminded us that pedagogy is politics. And he said this: pedagogy is a more complex and extensive term than teaching, referring to the integration in practice of particular curriculum content and design, classroom strategies and techniques, a time and space for the practice of those strategies and techniques, and evaluation purposes and methods. He goes on. In other words, talk about pedagogy is simultaneously talk about the details of what students and others might do together, and the cultural politics such practices support. To propose a pedagogy is to propose a political vision. In this perspective, we cannot talk about teaching practice without talking about politics. So, what are the current politics and economics of the web and of education? First, we have to consider that we are always involved in certain tautologies and what Foucault would call tactics or epistemological ironies. Language and literacy, we've learned this from all our philosophers of language, are tautological and tactical, which means what? We know what we already know, and we use it to maintain what we know. The not known is mediated by the known. So we can only express something new or try to process something new to us through what we already know. And if we're not conscious that if this, what we do not know is reduced to what we know, right, then our process, we lose this critical perspective of the fact that whenever we are learning something totally new to us, we are reducing it. We are seeing it through the categories of what we already know. So the possibility of access to something totally new to us is very distant. So if our known does not become the object of our reflection then, the categories of our known, when its opacity becomes apparent, the world continues to appear transparent or natural. The critique that Foucault gives, for example, when he defines critique, he says it's breaking out of this epistemological circle. When we first, our transparency, the naturalness of our world becomes opaque, and we realize that our world is not as natural as it seems. It's a cultural production. It's a collective cultural production. And only then can we begin to deal with what we don't know. Linda Alcoff calls this entrapment within one's own epistemology. And here I'm appealing to that other meaning of the word web. This entrapment within one's own epistemology as an epistemology of ignorance, in the sense that it protects us from seeing or understanding anything which may threaten our status quo. For the Brazilian educator, Paulo Freire, it involves what he calls rigor in thinking. And to think rigorously means to propose a break with naturalized common sense thinking. So for him, critical thinking is thinking rigorously. To think rigorously is to not think as you normally think, or not to succumb to your common sense thinking. In both cases, critical thinking involves being confronted with epistemological discontinuities. So we can only be critical about how we think when we are confronted with something very much unrelated to what we consider to be normal, natural. Critical resistance comes when one senses not only one's dependence on these constraints, but also one's tendency to give in to them. So I'm not using the idea of critical thinking or critical pedagogy here, which is what we've been using since the 70s, for example, which is to show the reality behind the masked ideological appearance of what looks like reality. That idea of critique is to show our students, to emancipate our students by showing them the truth behind the appearance of truth. Right? I'm using a sense of critique which is different, which comes from Freire, which I will show you later, which means thinking basically, why and how do I understand what I understand? Simply that. But first, what are we talking about in all this talk about the naturalness of our knowledge of the world and how it forces us into ignorance? Our current political and economic paradigm is what I'm focusing on. Neoliberalism. that thing many of us as teachers don't take much time to look at. This neoliberalism, which affects all of us, you here in Europe, us in Brazil, right? But it's become so normal that we don't see it anymore, right? It's part of what we consider to be natural, and it's affecting us in the universities and the academies especially, right? What does it mean? Reid says this: it's an ideology generated no longer from a state or a dominant class, as our traditional concept of ideology, but from the quotidian experience of buying and selling commodities from the market, which is then extended across other social spaces, the marketplace of ideas, to become an image of society. So suddenly we find ourselves living in a society which is a marketplace. Are we aware of this? How does this affect what we do in our classrooms? How does this affect what we are doing through our computer-mediated communications? Neoliberalism is an ideology that refers not only to the domain of politics, but also to the entirety of human existence. It's become so all-pervading at the moment that it's difficult to see an outside to it. It presents itself not as an ideal to be attained, but as a reality of human nature. And if we are not careful, we believe in it. Okay? But if we go back to those people who are looking at neoliberalism critically, and they begin with Foucault's early work in the late 70s, Wendy Brown and the Frenchmen Dardot and Laval, they basically say this: Foucault discussed neoliberalism as the interconnection between a particular conception of human nature, a particular formation of subjectivity, and a particular political ideology. So human nature, subjectivity, and a political ideology. These have become interconnected, and they affect all of us at this very moment. It is involved in producing new subjects, which are all of us here. Neoliberalism is not just a manner of governing states or economy, but is intimately tied to the government of the individual, to a particular manner of living. That's our way of living, which we consider to be normal and natural. In this neoliberal manner of living, the state and social practices are economized, and economic growth is seen to be the only valid social policy. You people in Europe are living through this, especially at the moment. We in Brazil are going through this. Right? A new subject is produced, but this new subject, produced over the last 20 years, is entrepreneurial in nature. So the market is the model for the creation of a subject. So each of us as individuals act, become, behave like markets. So from equal exchange to unequal competition. This is the neo in the neoliberal. How does it change from the traditional liberal idea of economics? In this economization of society, competition replaces exchange, which is what the traditional liberal idea was. Competition replaces exchange as a motivating force of the market, and inequality replaces equality as the point of departure for social interaction and exchange. So now what do we have? We have unequal exchanges competing with each other. Whereas equality was previously the basis for the liberal logic of exchange, inequality now forms the basis of the neoliberal logic of competition. So we compete as not equals. It's a different concept of competition. In this logic, the focus is on non-natural competition. What does this mean? Whereas in natural competition, the game is between equal individuals and equal behaviors, in the neoliberal conception, competition is seen to be a formal game between unequals. The formality of the game consists in the fact that the logic of the game is the game itself. So why do we compete? In order to compete. Because it's natural to compete, because it's normal to compete, because everybody competes. See, that's the logic. Rather than the game as a means to a specific end. This produces what we're all familiar with, the idea of the knowledge society. So when competition becomes the founding principle of the markets, all the subjects involved in the markets become capital to be negotiated, and they are no longer simple producers or workers or clients or consumers. The knowledge society is therefore born. So why do we need to acquire knowledge? To help us compete, to help us become more employable. As capital, each subject produced in this process becomes an enterprise whose lucrativity is based on its use of itself, its knowledge, its experience as capital. So we are not subjects who are learning knowledge for a certain benefit. We are subjects who our identity is inseparable from the knowledges that we acquire. So the more knowledge that we acquire, the better, the more successful we become as individuals in our society. But there's no point of arrival where we are successful, because the logic of the game is competition, so we have to constantly compete. So knowledge is never sufficient. The social consequence of this economization or entrepreneurialization of the individualized subject is to mask the formative and structural role of social categories such as class, gender, etc. Apparently, and this is the irony of this neoliberal competition, apparently we're all competing equally. But remember, the logic is of unequal competition. So the inequality of race, gender, class, etc., this is all part of the game. It privileges those who have more, so they can compete better, but we all have to compete. Social inequality, exploitation, or discrimination becomes invisible. Epistemological circularity and ignorance are established. So we don't stop to think, why are we competing? What are we competing for? Is there a point of arrival when we can say we've had enough of this competition? Now, the knowledge society then is the knowledge economy. This refers to the way that practices of knowledge and learning interact with practices of economics. The market becomes an actual organizing principle or manner of living in which knowledge or educational practices are a part. As Patrick claims, through the knowledge economy, I quote him, education has been incorporated into an agenda of wealth production at national state level. So educational policies of nations are in order to accrue benefit to the nation to be able to compete at a global level. All you have to do is look at educational policies where they will always connect with globalization, the global level, global competitiveness. The name of the game is competition. In this agenda of wealth production, education is portrayed as the driving force of economic growth and development and promises the much sought after capacity of competitiveness under globalized market conditions. And this is how education is connected to employability. So we think when we talk about employability that we're being beneficial to our students. Right? But how beneficial are we being if we are just continuing with this logic of competition, this market logic? The individual as self-responsible entrepreneurial subject. Here is one of the ironies which Stiegler calls the stupidity. This knowledge economy further conceives each individual as being economically responsible and economically self-interested. So each of us are economically responsible for our own success. Structure, social class, gender have got nothing to do with it. But they already give us a different position in the competition. But this doesn't matter. We're blind to this. Right? The onus is on the individuals in the knowledge economy to become self-regulatory and to guarantee their own competitiveness by increasing their marketable worth as capital by acquiring more knowledge than their peers. So the more that you can multitask, the more knowledge that you can acquire, the greater your capacity of competition, and then perhaps the greater your capacity of employability. The objective of education is to produce, from this perspective, self-interested, self-regulatory knowledge workers. What's missing from all of this? Preoccupation with the collective. Educational policies in the knowledge economy claim to provide to all learners the possibility of access to the same knowledges and abilities previously accessible only to learners of more privileged groups. Thus, access to knowledge is supposedly provided to all by state governments that implement and proclaim the neoliberal logic. However, remembering that the logic of the neoliberal game of competition is based on inequality, those individuals that already have access to privileged knowledges and already possess privileged abilities, for example, access to technology, by dint of belonging to more privileged groups, are seen to have this access based on merit and not privilege. Now, coming back to those terms that those three thinkers mentioned before: digital enclosures, lack of horizontality, the stupidity of rationalization. So they're all talking about the logic of unequal competition, the focus on individual profit to the detriment of the collective, the need to be engaged in the game for the game's sake. However, it's not a question of privileging the individual and prohibiting the collective. The focus on constant and continuous action in competition leaves no time to reflect and to make the connection between the individual and the collective. This is the stupidity that Stiegler refers to. We are so much engaged in this process of competing and being more efficient at competition, but we have little time to stop and think, why the hell are we competing? So no time is spent on reflecting on the conditions which produce the new entrepreneurial, individual, competitive subjects. So what are we currently doing when we educate through the web in this current context of neoliberalism and the competitive, entrepreneurial, individualistic subject? Oof, what a mouthful, right? Do we educate to reinforce or transform these contexts? So what I'm suggesting is there is a need for critique to focus on the conditions and the effects of the actions in which we are engaged in. Any opposition to neoliberalism must take seriously its efficacy, its effectiveness, the manner in which it has transformed subjectivity in relation to work and knowledge and interactive social relationships. So it's no good saying, let's have a revolution, let's throw a bomb on neoliberalism, we want out. No, we are part of it, there's no outside to it. Right? So what do we do? By understanding the logic, we can work through it. Right? So by operating without critique on the condition and effects of actions, it produces a sense of possibility. It emphasizes minimal investment and maximal returns. So when we are taught that it's your responsibility to educate yourself, right? Nowadays in Europe, you people have to pay for your own education. Not so 20 years ago. Right? It's no longer the responsibility of the collective to seek education. It's your own individual responsibility. Right? What's happening here? There's this idea of, as individuals, we're all forced to look for this sense of possibility. But the possibility that's in front of us is this idea of minimal investment, maximal returns, profitability. We have to develop ourselves as capital. The reigning ideal of interest and the calculations of cost and benefit produce the self-interested individual and consequently eliminate any possibility of transformation of the collective conditions of existence. So we can't think to stop about the collectivity. What do I have in common with my neighbor, with the next person here, because I'm too busy competing with him. Right? These transformations are not prohibited. So neoliberalism doesn't say collectivity is prohibited. Right? Transformations are not prohibited, but not seen as possible. Closed off by a society made of self-interested individuals. So we have no time to think about the collectivity. It's not prohibited. Right? They are not possible because an interruption of the game of competition seems to be needed in order to counter the game. So when do we stop the game? We have no time to stop the game. So when do we start thinking critically? Right? This is what we cannot see a way out. But critical literacy, I suggest, is a response. Now, what do I mean by this? A political and educational response to neoliberalism must focus on the production of subjectivity, which is the logic of neoliberalism. The production of subjectivity, freedom, and possibility. It must focus on reconnecting the individual and the collective in the process of subject formation. It must reconnect the individual and the collective in the process of meaning making. It must, in other words, replace competition with solidarity, our connection with others. So, critical literacy involves what? Denaturalizing the natural, making opaque the transparent. However, as I said, not like the critical pedagogy of former years, not to see the reality out there, but to understand the processes through which we perceive and understand what we take to be real. It involves asking ourselves these questions. Why do I understand what I understand? Why does he or she understand what he or she understands? The focus, therefore, must be on recuperating a collective genealogy or history of subject formation and meaning making. So what in my past brings me to understand what I understand? What in my past brings me to not understand what I don't understand? My individual process of meaning making connects with my history and the groups or collectivities to which I belong. And here, this is something which I think Brazilian educator Paulo Freire referred to before he died. This is a posthumous publication. He was talking about this in the 1980s, on the collective origins of the perceiving individual I. How important it is for the individual subject to perceive his collective origins. And he says, the I can only develop from a non-I. Contrary to the fact that the we is a plurality of I's, the we is where we come from when we become an I. So he says this, the consciousness of the world, the consciousness of the existence of difference or alterity creates in me my consciousness of myself. Where did we learn our language from? From our parents, from our community. He says this means that it was the world itself as my other that said to me, you are you. So before I become an I was the you of someone else. So as an individual, I'm not dislocated in time and space. I'm the product of a collectivity, of someone who first saw me as a you. In encounters, then, one needs to learn to listen, not only to how one's interlocutor, he says, is in the world, but also to listen to how, as learners, we are with the world. In the world refers to the space which we share with our interlocutors, the people we are interacting with. And with the world is the history that we bring with ourselves, where we come from, and how that affects how we interact or relate with the people who we are relating to in a particular moment. I'm finishing now. The role of interculturality in making the connection, the individual-collective connection. So interculturality is generally seen to involve contact with, which is intergroup contact, culture to culture, collective to collective. Interculturality for the Brazilian anthropologist Vives de Castro involves what he calls a process of equivocal translation and makes clear the role of the collective in individual meaning making. He says, an equivocation in translation is not just a failure to understand when we are communicating across cultures, but a failure to understand that understandings are necessarily not the same. So when I think I've understood the other and the other thinks he has understood me, we must remember that those understandings may not be the same thing. In other words, there is no point of total overlap between our understandings. Intercultural translation involves, therefore, what he calls stereotypic vision, the need that each eye, we all have two eyes with which we see, but remember that each eye sees something different. And what we see, and gives us the impression of 3 dimensions, is the fact that each eye sees something different. So each eye must see something different in order for something new to be seen. Interculturality, therefore, which is normally outward, collective to collective, collectivity becomes clear. It makes clear the opacity in contact with an external other. Right? So I have one culture, the other has another culture. That's why we have difficulty in interacting. But if it is not brought home, if interculturality is not brought home or inward, the connection between the individual involved in intercultural contact and his or her own collectivity, his or her own process of meaning making. Epistemologies of ignorance and the new normal of neoliberalism remain intact. So what am I saying here? In interculturality, whatever we learn when we're interacting with someone from another culture, we should bring this learning home and use it to interact with the others in our own culture. This will make opaque in our own culture what we consider to be transparent. Bringing interculturality inwards involves perceiving the others that construct me and these processes of construction. The focus must pedagogically be shifted to how do I relate to my own collectivity? What is the connection between my apparent individual difference and the collectivities to which I belong? So what I can learn from intercultural contact with a member of a different culture can teach me a lot about my own individual collective formation. Finally, replacing competition with solidarity. This is Freire. It says, meaning making in critical literacy involves connecting two kinds of context, being with the world, as I mentioned, and being in the world. Being with the world is time and history. Being in the world is place, togetherness. So who am I with now? Are they coming from the same places or origins that I come from? How do these affect why I understand what I understand, and why do I not understand what I don't? And finally, I end with this diagram here, trying to represent what I've said so far. So we have two selves in contact, either through the web or face-to-face, right? And this, we can call this interaction, translation, digital enclosure, whatever. But what we are talking about is the interaction is taking place between people from different backgrounds, right? And if we see it as simple equal to equal, we will have a problem. So the contact here involves power relations, politics, economics. This is being in the world. It's our moment, the place of contact. And this is our genealogy. Where are we coming from? What knowledges are we bringing to this moment of contact? These knowledges will be different because they have different histories, right? And this is the fact that they have different histories, right, will result in this shock that we will have over here. And I finally end with this. These words from Sousa Santos, a Portuguese thinker, where he says, the less a given way of knowing knows the limits of its knowing about other ways of knowing, the less aware it is of its own limits and possibilities. So knowledge is critical. Knowledge, a critical teaching, is to focus on how we produce knowledge, not trying to find the reality out there. Right? If we can understand how we are produced as subjects in the context in which we live, our manner of living, that's a great step towards learning how to deal with others. Thank you very much. We can take.
You can take some questions. we have a little bit of time.
Thank you very much for a thought-provoking and very interesting lecture. I would like to go back to the first, I think, or second slide, and ask you to elaborate a bit on how this critical understanding relates to the educational situation in Brazil.
Mm-hmm. Well, I can start off from over here. In Brazil, what we are also within this neoliberal paradigm, right, of competition and the subject formation of individuals. But this is in contradiction to a government that we have which emphasizes the collective. Right? So we have, this is our political situation in Brazil today. Right? We are dominated by an economic, political, neoliberal paradigm, but we have a government that produces policies of benefit to the collective. It is being forced to renegotiate Because what happens? Every time you have a policy produced for the collective, within a neoliberal paradigm of competition, it is seen as slowing down competition. It is seen as not contributing to individual subject formation, but it's seen as leveling everybody. So one of the realities we have in Brazil in the last 20 years of, the last 12 years, let's say, more specifically of our present, let's say, left-tending government, has been to bring millions of people to the middle class, right? Something like 35 million people from poverty into the middle class. Now, the pre-existing middle classes within this neoliberal paradigm see this as something completely negative because there is no focus on the collectivity. So the fact that you have people coming up from poverty is seen as something negative because it's slowing down the possibility of individual competition. So middle-class families are saying that all of this investment in the public school system is to the detriment of our children. The fact that children who were illiterate or working in the streets are now in school is seen as something negative. So we have this, we are living through this, this political situation of extreme conflict and contradictions between two different paradigms. Which is the result, what we see there is the result of this. And one of the problems in that data, which I could be here all day talking about that data which the British Council focused on hides a lot of information which needs to be had in order to understand it. The fact that 90% of the population, school-going population, is in public schools, and at the same time, 80% of the teachers of public schools are university educated and middle class. So there's a huge attitudinal problem we have with teachers in public schools, and this generates violence, unfortunately. Is there a way out? I don't know. We're trying. I hope I've answered your question.
Thank you for that very stimulating talk. As a teacher educator, I have a question. Well, I feel guilty right now because I recognize that I'm very much one of those who's promoting the neoliberal ideas and by promoting the 21st century competences. But then you think, but don't I have a responsibility to ensure that at least they're out there competing? Because if I don't do that, then they fall even further behind. So I don't know if you have a way of perhaps assuaging my guilt or something.
It depends on how we understand education. Are we educating people to fit in to a system that we already have? Are we educating to transform a society that we have at the moment? If we follow the old, the Enlightenment project of education, which was to bring people out of darkness into light, right? Then if we educate for our present situation, we're not bringing light to anything, right? We're educating people to fit in because we don't know what the future. We don't know what the future is going to hold for us. So do we educate? Do we produce students who are only capable of functioning in the present, or are they capable of functioning in unknown situations? I think that's a question that we have to ask ourselves as educators. So do we give them recipes, in other words, for situations that we already know, which may make them employable? Or do we prepare them for living in new situations which could occur 5 minutes from now, 10 years from now?
Okay, I'm sorry to run out of coffee.
Thank you.